Video game consoles. You know, those hulking pieces of metal and plastic you buy to put in your living room and distract your kids from the fact that your marriage is on the rocks and your finances are in shambles. Yeah, you know what these are. They've been a facet of entertainment for a while now, and it seems as though there's always been some variety. You know, Nintendo or Sega, PlayStation or Xbox. But at one point in time, in the early 2000s, one console completely dominated the market. It was the console everyone had, whether you were young or old, hardcore or casual. I'm talking, of course, about the PlayStation 2. In this video, I'd like to examine the history of this hegemon of gaming, why it was so successful, and why nobody else will ever reach those heights again. First, a little history. PlayStation 2 was released back in 2000 to replace the aging PlayStation, and both of these facts work in the console's favor. You see, PlayStation had been Sony's entry into the console business, and it had also been Sony's entry into the business of kicking fucking ass, because that's what it did. It sold a shit ton of units and established Sony as a force to be reckoned with in the industry. And so by the time the PlayStation 2 was coming out, there were plenty of consumers and developers who couldn't wait to see what the sequel had to offer. And that release date, March 2000 in Japan and October 2000 in North America, that becomes a factor too. Neither Microsoft nor Nintendo would have consoles out until November of 2001. The only competition the PS2 had at launch was the Sega Dreamcast. But it ended up being discontinued 18 months into its run for reasons I'll get into later, which left the PS2 unchallenged for 6 months until the release of the Xbox. This gave the console the time it needed to cement itself in the market as the console to buy. But no one was buying it just because it was there. I mean, people wanted to actually use the damn thing, so what could you do with it? Well, that's a very silly question, you might say. It's a games console. It plays video games. Correct. But hear me out, alright, it also was a DVD player. It was a decently powerful system, although it was actually weaker than the Xbox and the GameCube. Despite that, developers were still bending over backwards to develop for the thing, anticipating that it would be just as, if not more successful than its predecessor. In 2001 alone, you saw the release of Silent Hill 2, Jak and Daxter, Klonoa 2, Twisted Metal Black, Final Fantasy X, SSX Tricky, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, Gran Turismo 3, Metal Gear Solid 2, Grand Theft Auto 3, and probably other games not listed as the most critically acclaimed games of 2001. Like I said, by the time Xbox and GameCube had released, Sony already had a formidable library under its belt, and what really didn't help the competition was the fact that its momentum never let up. Absolute bangers just kept dropping left and right. I'm talking GTA's Vice City and San Andreas. I'm talking Metal Gear Solid 3. I'm talking original Ratchet & Clank trilogy. I'm talking Gran Turismo 4. 9,000 games would be released for this thing, the last of which came out in 2013. Obviously not all of these are winners, but the best among them helped define the PlayStation 2 as one of the greatest systems ever made. But Gilger, I hear you saying, what about the competition? The original Xbox launched in 2001, and despite backing from The Rock himself, it just couldn't wrestle the title away from Sony. That's not to say it was bad. It was the most powerful console on the market, but devs and gamers alike had absolutely no idea what to expect from the scary green X. Most simply just stuck with the safe option. It wasn't all a bust for Microsoft, though. A few companies did give them a chance, and some classic games did come out for the console. It helped legitimize Microsoft in the industry, and even if it couldn't take down Sony, they did manage to outdo a few other industry veterans in the process. And speaking of veterans, the GameCube also released in 2001, and represented Nintendo's attempt to regain some ground after the disappointment that was the N64. What actually happened was an even bigger disappointment. Maybe that's because they still couldn't quite get over themselves in their weird formats, deciding to use these little itty-bitty discs instead of, normal DVDs. Another could be the fact that it was perceived as a toy by the public. I mean, look, it had a handle on the back. This was made for children to carry between houses. More serious gamers who might have still had faith in Nintendo totally abandoned it. Nintendo's strength had always been its IPs, and the console had no shortage of Nintendo staples, but those only got them so far. The GameCube became Nintendo's worst selling console up to that point, but lucky for them it didn't totally sink the company. Unlike Sega. You see, Sega thought they'd pull a fast one by dropping the Dreamcast in 1999 ahead of all their competitors. The issue was that by September of 99, people already knew that the PlayStation 2 was gonna come out soon, so they just waited for that instead of buying a Dreamcast. Unlike Sony, who benefited from the reputation and performance of their last console, Sega had squandered what goodwill they had through the unmitigated disaster that was the Sega Saturn. Very few were willing to work with their console out of fear that whatever they released would never turn a profit. While a few companies did decide to release games, it wasn't enough to save the console, and it was discontinued in 2001, marking Sega's exit from the console market. So there you have it. The system succeeded because it came out first, it had plenty of devs willing to make games, and plenty of players willing to play those games. So that begs a question. Why hasn't any console been able to replicate this success? Well, for one, after having such great success with the PS2, Sony assumed that people would lap up whatever they put out, and decided it would be a good idea to sell their new console for $600 and make it harder for devs to actually work with it. This is what we in the business call biting the hand that feeds. Because of this, everybody went and bought a 360 or a Wii instead, and Sony spent the rest of the generation playing catch-up. Microsoft, for their part, started out the generation with the right ideas, putting their console out early and securing exclusives before deciding to turn around and try to compete with the Wii, which didn't really work. The real turnaround came in 2013, when Microsoft decided to appeal to people who watched The Price is Right instead of actual gamers with their new Xbox One. Suddenly, half the people who bought Xbox 360s went and bought a PS4 that November instead. To date, the PlayStation 4 is the closest Sony's come to replicating the success of the PS2, selling 110 million units over its 7 years, with its closest competitor being the Nintendo Switch with 60 million units. By comparison, the PS2 sold 155 million units over its lifetime, with its closest competitor being the Xbox with 24 million units. It's just not the same. I honestly don't think that any console will ever be able to reach those heights again. The industry is just too stable, fan bases are too entrenched, and I just don't see the kind of conditions you'd need for one console to totally dominate popping up anytime soon. PS2 represents a very different time, when gaming was still in flux. There was no PC master race, consoles would come and go like the wind, and big companies could still be trusted to put out excellent titles with relative frequency. It was a simpler time, when a young Gilger would sit down in front of his TV every day and spend hours failing to play Crash Tag Team Racing. And it'll never happen again.